1948. 17 shops. 7 days. Brooklyn's crew crushed every owner who refused to pay. Bumpy Johnson watched it all and did nothing. They took that silence as weakness. But within 48 hours, every single one of them vanished from Harlem's streets. To understand how one man dismantled an entire operation without firing a single public shot, we go back to where the first door was slammed shut. The smell hit you first. Smoke, grease, and something sour underneath the kind of fear that soaks into walls and doesn't wash out. Harlem in March. 1948 smelled like a neighborhood holding its breath. The butcher shops, the laundromats, the corner groceries. Their windows were dark before 8 o'clock. Closed signs hung crooked on doors that used to stay open until midnight. Old men who had sat on the same stoops for 20 years now walked with their eyes down, their hands in their pockets, moving fast and saying nothing. It had taken Brooklyn's crew exactly 7 days to do that. They came in quiet at first. 2 men, sometimes 3, stepping into a shop just before closing time. No raised voices, no drawn weapons. Just a conversation, the kind that ends with a number written on a napkin and a handshake that isn't really a handshake. The shopkeepers of Harlem had seen this before, in different forms, from different men. They knew the rhythm of it. You paid. You stayed open. You kept your mouth shut and your family safe. But Brooklyn's crew wasn't interested in rhythm. They were interested in dominance. The first beating happened on a Tuesday. A dry cleaner named Roosevelt Webb refused to open his register. He was 61 years old, had run his shop on 126th Street for 19 years, and had never once been touched. Brooklyn's men left him on the floor with 2 broken ribs and a fractured jaw. They took the cash from the register anyway. They left the door wide open so the whole block could see him lying there, face against the linoleum, breathing in short, wet gasps. By Thursday, 4 more shops had been hit. By Saturday, the number was 9. By the end of the week, 17 businesses had been marked, beaten, or both. The message was not subtle. Brooklyn wasn't asking for a piece of Harlem. Brooklyn was taking all of it. Bumpy Johnson heard about Roosevelt Webb within the hour. He was sitting in the back room of a restaurant on Lenox Avenue when the news reached him, delivered by a young man named Curtis who could barely keep his voice steady. Bumpy listened without interrupting. He didn't move from his chair. He didn't raise his voice. He set down his coffee cup with the same slow, deliberate care he always used. And he looked at the wall for a long moment before he spoke. "Tell me the route they took coming in," he said, "and the time." Curtis blinked. "You want to know the time?" "I want to know everything." Bumpy said, "Sit down." What most people misunderstood about Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, was the stillness. They saw a man who didn't react and assumed he didn't feel. That was the mistake. Bumpy felt everything. He had grown up in Harlem, had watched it transform from a neighborhood into a battleground and back again, had spent years learning which men kept their word and which men bled when you pressed the right place. He understood Harlem the way a surgeon understands a body, not with affection, but with precision. He knew that Brooklyn coming in hard and fast meant one of 2 things. Either they were stupid, or they had been told that Harlem had no one left to answer back. Neither option sat well with him. For 3 days, Bumpy did nothing visible. He walked his usual routes. He ate at his usual places. He nodded to the men he always nodded to and said nothing. He didn't need to say. But behind that stillness, something was assembling itself with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that the first move is almost never the right move. He sent out 6 people he trusted not to threaten, not to confront, but to watch, to note the faces, the cars, the timing, which block they hit first, how long they stayed, where they went after, whether they reported back to the same location every night or changed their routes. Within 72 hours, Bumpy had a map in his head that Brooklyn didn't know existed. Then came the night that changed the calculation. A grocery store owner named Daniel Park, a man who had known Bumpy for 15 years, who had quietly looked the other way more times than either of them would ever count, was closing up his shop on a Friday evening when 3 of Brooklyn's men walked through his door. His 11-year-old son was in the back, doing homework at a folding table beside the stockroom. What happened next was not a negotiation. They hit Daniel Park in front of his son. Not once. Not to make a point. They hit him the way men hit when they want the other person to understand that the hitting can always get worse. The boy sat frozen at his table, pencil still in his hand, watching his father get taken apart by 3 men in winter coats who never once raised their voices. When Bumpy heard about it that night, something shifted in him, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of finality that doesn't reverse. He folded the piece of paper where he'd been writing names and routes and times. He put it in his coat pocket. He stood up. "All right," he said to no one in particular. "Now we start." They said not every beating made it into the papers. Most never did. The ones that mattered most rarely left a single written record, only the memory of the people who saw them, carried quietly for the rest of their lives. In the world Bumpy Johnson moved through, the man who controlled fear was the man who collected the money. Brooklyn had understood that. What they hadn't understood was that Harlem already had someone who understood it better, and that man had just decided to stop watching. There were rules in Harlem. Nobody wrote them down. You didn't need to. The rules existed the way gravity exists, not because someone declared them, but because the consequences of ignoring them were immediate and physical and final. Every serious operator in New York understood them. The neighborhoods were divided not by law but by history, by reputation, by the accumulated weight of decades of arrangement. You stayed in your territory. You respected the lines. You didn't reach across someone else's table and take food off their plate. Brooklyn had crossed every one of those lines in 7 days. The men running Brooklyn's expansion weren't amateurs. They were organized, disciplined, and connected to money that moved through legitimate businesses and illegitimate ones with equal ease. Their leader on the ground was a man known only as Caruso, not a boss himself, but the kind of man bosses trusted to handle complicated situations without asking too many questions. Caruso was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that had been rearranged at least once by someone who knew what they were doing. He ran the collection routes personally for the first 2 weeks, which meant he understood the operation the way generals understand terrain from the ground up, not from a map. He had come to Harlem because someone above him had decided Harlem was available. That decision was based on a misreading of the situation so complete that it would take weeks to fully understand how wrong it was. Bumpy Johnson sent his first message on a Wednesday. He didn't send it through a lawyer or a mediator or a neutral party over dinner. He sent it through a man named Gerald, who worked as a driver and had contacts in both worlds. And the message was delivered verbally to a mid-level collector named Price, who worked directly under Caruso. The message was 4 sentences long. It named Caruso by name. It named the street corners where Brooklyn's crew had been operating, and it told him clearly not as a threat, but as a statement of fact that what was happening needed to stop before it became something that couldn't be stopped. Price delivered the message. Caruso listened to all 4 sentences. Then he told Price to go home, and he called the man above him, and they had a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes. And the conclusion of that conversation was that Bumpy Johnson was a local problem who had been managing a shrinking operation for years and did not have the infrastructure, the manpower, or the backing to do anything about what was happening. They were wrong about all three. What Caruso didn't know what the men above him hadn't told him, either because they didn't know or because they didn't think it mattered, was that Bumpy Johnson's position in Harlem was not built on manpower. It was built on information, on relationships, on the kind of loyalty that doesn't appear in any ledger but shows up exactly when you need it to, in exactly the form you need it to take. Bumpy had spent 20 years building something that looked, from the outside, like a modest criminal operation managing numbers and protection in a single neighborhood. What it actually was a network, dense, quiet, and deeply embedded in every block, every building, every business that mattered in Harlem. When Brooklyn ignored his warning, Bumpy didn't get angry. He got organized. He called in 6 men he had known for a decade or more. He met with them separately, never as a group, in locations that changed each time. He told each of them a different piece of what he needed. No single person in that network knew the full shape of what was being assembled. That was intentional. It had always been intentional. The first thing he did was pull the protection from 3 blocks where Brooklyn had been operating. Not loudly. No announcement. No confrontation. The men who had been quietly discouraging petty crime in those areas simply stopped showing up. Within 48 hours, 2 small thefts occurred that Brooklyn's crew was unable to prevent. The shopkeepers on those blocks noticed. Word moved through Harlem the way it always moved, not through newspapers or official channels, but through the invisible telephone of people who share a neighborhood and a set of unspoken agreements about how things work. Brooklyn, it turned out, could not protect the people they were extorting. That was the first crack. The second move was more direct. Bumpy identified the man who ran the money between Brooklyn's street operation and wherever it was going when it left Harlem. His name was a detail that has never been confirmed in any official account. But what he did is clear enough. He served as the connective tissue between what happened on the street and what got reported upward. Cut him, and the operation went blind. Bumpy didn't cut him. Not yet. He let him keep working. But he made sure, through a series of arrangements too quiet to trace, that the numbers reaching Brooklyn were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just off enough to create confusion, to make Caruso look inefficient to the men above him, to introduce the first notes of doubt into a relationship built entirely on trust. It was the kind of move that required patience most men don't have. It required the willingness to let the other side feel strong while you quietly removed the floor beneath them. Some people will tell you the line between Harlem and Brooklyn never really existed, as anything more than a story men told themselves. Maybe. But the consequences of crossing it were real enough. The warning had been sent. The warning had been ignored. What came next was no longer a negotiation. It was a reckoning. And it would move at Bumpy Johnson's speed, which meant it would be quiet and precise. And by the time Brooklyn understood what was happening, it would already be done. The rain came in sideways that Thursday night. It hit the windows of Harlem's buildings like 1,000 small fists, relentless and cold. The kind of March rain that soaks through a coat in 60 seconds and sits in your shoes for the rest of the evening. The streets emptied fast. The few people still out moved with their heads down, collars up, not looking at anything they didn't have to look at. The city had a sound on nights like this, not silence exactly, but a low, wet hum. The sound of a place waiting for something to happen. Bumpy Johnson sat at a table near the back of a barber shop that had been closed for 2 hours. The lights were off except for a single lamp in the corner that threw everything into deep shadow. 3 men sat with him. They were not the kind of men who showed up in photographs or got mentioned in newspapers. They were the kind of men who had been in this world long enough to understand that visibility was a liability, and they had made themselves useful precisely by being invisible. "If we hit them directly," one of the men said, "we pull them into a war, a real one, street by street." "I know," Bumpy said. "We don't have the numbers for that. Not fast enough." "I know that too." There was a silence in the room that had weight to it. The rain hammered the windows. Someone shifted in their chair. Bumpy looked at the small map he had sketched on the back of a folded piece of paper, not a detailed map. Just marks indicating corners, routes, times. He had been refining it for 5 days. He knew Brooklyn's collection route the way he knew his own neighborhood, not because he had followed them, but because the people who see everything in a neighborhood had been feeding him information in pieces small enough that no single person had given anything significant away. "We don't hit them," Bumpy said finally. "We hit the system." The distinction mattered enormously. A direct confrontation between Bumpy's crew and Brooklyn's men would have been visible, bloody, and politically complicated. It would have invited police attention at a scale that served no one. It would have damaged the shopkeepers Bumpy was trying to protect as much as it damaged Brooklyn. And it would have given Brooklyn's bosses back in their own territory exactly the justification they needed to escalate to send more men, more money, more pressure. Bumpy had no interest in giving them that justification. What he intended to do instead was make Brooklyn's operation in Harlem financially worthless, without Brooklyn ever fully understanding why. The first phase was communication. Brooklyn's crew in Harlem operated through a network of intermediaries, men who passed messages, confirmed collections, reported problems, upward. These intermediaries were not soldiers. They were facilitators. And unlike soldiers, they had not signed up for a war. They had signed up for a job that paid reasonably well and, until recently, carried limited personal risk. Bumpy's people began approaching them quietly. Not with threats. Threats would have driven them further into Brooklyn's orbit. Instead, with information. Carefully chosen pieces of information designed to make each intermediary feel that his position was more precarious than he had understood, that the men above him knew less than they claimed, and that the situation in Harlem was moving in a direction that did not end well for people caught in the middle. It was a slow operation. It required patience. It required the ability to plant a seed and walk away and trust that it would grow without being watered again. While that was happening, something else surfaced that Bumpy had not anticipated. One of the men in his own network had been talking. The information reached Bumpy indirectly, the way dangerous information usually does through a chain of small observations, each individually meaningless, that only resolved into a clear picture when you held them together at the right angle. A detail mentioned in one place that couldn't have been known without access to a specific conversation. A timing that didn't add up. A response from Brooklyn that arrived faster than it should have, given what they should have known. Someone in Harlem was feeding Brooklyn information. Not everything the damage would have been much worse if it had been everything, but enough. Enough to keep Brooklyn slightly ahead of each move. Enough to blunt the effect of Bumpy's disruptions before they could fully land. Bumpy absorbed this information without showing it. He continued his meetings. He continued his routines. He gave no indication that he had noticed anything. But internally, he began running the list. Not a written list, never a written list, but the list he kept in his head of who knew what, who had been where, who could have had access to which pieces of the operation. The list was shorter than it might have been. Bumpy had always run a tight circle. That meant the answer was going to be uncomfortable. On the street level, Brooklyn's collection operation was continuing, but with increasing friction. 3 routes had been slowed. 2 intermediaries had quietly stepped back from their roles, citing personal reasons that everyone understood were not personal. The money was still moving, but it was taking longer and requiring more effort, and in an operation built on the premise that Harlem would simply capitulate, that friction was beginning to register. Caruso had begun asking questions. The man who guarded one of Brooklyn's primary collection routes, a careful, methodical operator who knew the neighborhood better than most, started noticing the same faces appearing on different blocks at different times, always at a distance, never doing anything that could be identified as threatening, but present in a pattern that didn't feel random. He reported this to Caruso. Caruso told him to increase the size of the collection teams. That was the wrong response, and Bumpy knew it would be. More men on the street meant more visibility, more friction with local residents, more chances for something to go wrong in a way that created unwanted attention. Brooklyn was trying to solve a problem of control with a solution of force. And in Harlem, that equation had never worked for anyone who wasn't from there. The real power, Bumpy understood, is always quiet. You never notice it until it's already gone, and by then, the damage is done and the balance has already shifted to someone else. That was the lesson Brooklyn had failed to learn before stepping across the line, and it was the lesson they were about to be taught in the most direct way possible. The rain didn't stop until almost 4 a.m. By then, Bumpy was already gone from the barber shop. The lamp in the corner had been switched off. The map on the folded piece of paper was in his coat pocket, or had been burned, depending on which version of the story you believe. And most of the people who were there are no longer around to settle the question. What is certain is that by the time the sun came up over Harlem that Friday morning, the shape of the conflict had changed in ways that Brooklyn would not fully understand for another week. And somewhere in Bumpy Johnson's circle, a man who had been selling information was sitting with the particular stillness of someone who doesn't yet know he has already been found out. The yellow light in the back room of the laundromat had been flickering for 3 days. Nobody fixed it. The owner didn't ask. And the men who used that room for conversations that never happened didn't complain. The flickering had become part of the atmosphere, a slow, irregular pulse that made every face in the room look slightly wrong, slightly unreliable, like a photograph taken at the wrong moment. Bumpy Johnson sat beneath that light on a Saturday evening and laid out what he knew. It had taken him 4 days to assemble the full picture, and even now he was missing pieces. But the shape of it was clear enough. For the past 2 weeks, Brooklyn had been responding to his moves with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. When he pulled protection from the 3 blocks on the east side, Caruso had reinforced those exact blocks within 36 hours before the effect of pulling protection had even become visible on the street. When Bumpy had shifted his communication route through a different intermediary, Brooklyn had made contact with that intermediary within 48 hours of the switch. The only explanation was that someone inside his circle was talking. Not occasionally, consistently, in real time. Bumpy went through the list in his head the way he had gone through it a dozen times already, not with anger, but with the cold, methodical precision of a man who understands that emotion is a luxury that gets people killed. He thought about who had been in which room, who had heard which conversation, who had access to the specific combination of details that had been reaching Brooklyn. The list narrowed to 4 people, then 3, then 1. His name was Marcus Webb, no relation to the dry cleaner on 126th Street. Just the same common name that Harlem shared around like a worn deck of cards. Marcus had been with Bumpy for 6 years. He ran messages, kept schedules, and knew more about the daily mechanics of Bumpy's operation than almost anyone else in the circle. He was 31 years old, quiet by nature, and had always given the impression of a man who understood his role and was comfortable inside it. Bumpy had trusted him. That was the part that sat heaviest. He sent word to have Marcus brought in, not summoned, not confronted, just brought in casually, the way men were brought in for regular check-ins. Routine, nothing alarming. He needed Marcus relaxed when they spoke. Marcus arrived at the laundromat at 8:30. carrying a paper bag from a diner 2 blocks over, still wearing his coat. He sat down across from Bumpy with the ease of a man who had sat in that chair many times before. He set the paper bag on the table. He looked at Bumpy. He waited. Bumpy looked back at him for a long moment without speaking. "Tell me something," Bumpy said finally. "How long have you been afraid?" Marcus went very still. Not the stillness of innocence, the stillness of a man whose internal calculation has just shifted violently, who is running through options in the space of a breath and finding none of them good. His hands were flat on the table. His eyes didn't move. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "I think you do," Bumpy said. "I think you've known this conversation was coming for at least a week. I think you've been hoping it wouldn't. But you knew it would. And here we are." The paper bag sat between them. Somewhere outside, a car moved slowly through the wet street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the frosted window. Marcus exhaled. It was a long, slow breath, the kind that carries something out of a person that doesn't come back. "They have my brother," he said. Bumpy didn't move. "In Brooklyn, he owes money not to Caruso, to the people above Caruso. Real money, the kind of number that doesn't get forgiven." Marcus's voice was flat, stripped of everything except the bare fact of it. "They came to me 8 weeks ago. They said if I passed along what I knew, the debt would be reduced. I told myself it would be temporary, that I'd find another way to get the money, that I'd figure something out before it got to this point. But it got to this point," Bumpy said. "It got to this point." The room was very quiet. The light flickered once, twice, then steadied. Bumpy leaned forward. "Who's above Caruso?" Marcus hesitated. Not long, just the length of a man measuring the distance between 2 different kinds of danger. "They never gave me a name," he said. "But the man who came to me, the one who made the arrangement, he wasn't from Brooklyn. He was connected uptown. Old money. Old organization. The kind of name that people in this business don't say out loud." Bumpy absorbed that. It changed the shape of everything. Brooklyn hadn't come to Harlem on their own initiative. They had been sent, or at minimum, encouraged by something larger and older that had decided Harlem was a revenue opportunity and had arranged for inside access before the first crew ever crossed the bridge. The operation had been seeded from the beginning. The intelligence network had been built before the intimidation campaign started. That meant this was never just Brooklyn overreaching. It was a coordinated move by people with enough reach to compromise someone inside Bumpy Johnson's own circle and enough patience to wait for the right moment to use that access. The name of the person behind it never made it into any record that still exists. Some things in that world stayed buried, not because people forgot them, but because remembering them out loud carried consequences that outlasted the men who could have confirmed the story. Bumpy sat back in his chair. "You should have come to me," he said, not with anger, just with the weight of a fact being stated. "I know," Marcus said. "You knew I could have helped with the money. I know that too. So why didn't you?" Marcus looked at the table. "Because I was ashamed, and because I was scared that you'd handle it in a way that made it worse for my brother before it got better." Bumpy said nothing for a moment. Then he stood up, buttoned his coat, and looked at Marcus with an expression that contained no judgment and no mercy, just the clear, undisguised assessment of a man deciding exactly how something needs to be handled. "Truth doesn't kill people, Marcus," he said quietly, "but it decides who has to go." He picked up his hat. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "Don't leave the city," he said. "I'm not done with you yet." Harlem was too quiet that Sunday morning. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that has a texture to it. a density, like the air before a storm, when the birds have already gone and the sky hasn't decided yet what it's going to do. The vendors on the corner weren't shouting. The kids who usually ran between the buildings were nowhere. Even the dogs had gone inside. The neighborhood had a sense about these things that no one could explain and no one needed to. Something was coming. Bumpy walked to church that morning the way he always did, the same route, the same pace, nodding to the same faces. He wore the same dark coat he wore every Sunday. He carried himself with the unremarkable steadiness of a man who has nowhere urgent to be. Anyone watching him would have seen nothing unusual. Inside, Bumpy was constructing a trap. The problem with what Marcus had told him was not the betrayal itself. Betrayal was a variable Bumpy had always built into his calculations. The problem was strategic. He now knew that Brooklyn had an information pipeline into his operation. But Brooklyn didn't know that he knew. That gap between what they assumed and what was actually true was an asset, a significant one. But only if he used it correctly and only once. Because the moment he acted on it, the gap would close and the asset would be gone. He needed to make the single use count. The plan he assembled that afternoon was simple in structure and precise in execution. He would feed Marcus a piece of false information, specific enough to be believable, significant enough that Brooklyn would act on it immediately if they received it. The information would point to a meeting that wasn't happening, at a location that would be watched, involving a money transfer that didn't exist. If Brooklyn moved on it, he would have confirmation of the pipeline. He would also have Brooklyn's response team in a location of his choosing, at a time of his choosing, without their knowledge. He met with Marcus that evening in the same laundromat, under the same flickering light. He laid it out plainly. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and you're going to pass it to your contact in Brooklyn, exactly as I say it. Not one word changed." Marcus looked at him. "And my brother?" "Your brother is already handled," Bumpy said. "I made a call this morning. The debt is suspended. He has 30 days. The expression that crossed Marcus's face was not relief. It was something more complicated than that. The expression of a man who has just discovered that the person he betrayed was more capable of protecting him than the people he betrayed him to. "Why would you do that?" Marcus asked. "Because I need you functional," Bumpy said, "and because the alternative was worse for both of us. Don't mistake this for forgiveness." He handed Marcus a single piece of paper with 4 lines written on it. A time, a location, a name that meant nothing, and a number. He watched Marcus read it. He watched Marcus fold it and put it in his shirt pocket. "Tonight," Bumpy said, "before midnight." Marcus passed the information that night. By 10 o'clock the following morning, Bumpy's men watching the location had counted 8 of Brooklyn's people moving into position 2 blocks from where the supposed meeting was to take place. Caruso had sent a serious team. Not collectors, not intermediaries, but men who were there for a different purpose entirely. Brooklyn hadn't come to observe. They had come to end something. Bumpy received the count in a phone call at 10:45. He sat with it for a few minutes. 8 men. Caruso had committed real resources to this, which meant the information had been received as credible at a level above Caruso, which meant the people above Caruso were now actively involved in whatever was being planned for Harlem. That was the confirmation he needed. He called the operation off not with any visible signal, just by simply not showing up, which was the plan from the start. Brooklyn's team waited at the location for 2 hours before pulling back. They would return to Caruso with nothing. Caruso would return to the people above him with nothing, and the questions that failure generated would travel upward through the organization and begin doing damage at exactly the level where Bumpy needed damage done. Now there was the question of Marcus. He had done what was asked. He had delivered the information correctly. His brother had 30 days of breathing room, in another world, in a cleaner story. That might have been the end of it, a transaction completed, a debt settled, everyone moving forward with a revised understanding of the arrangement. This was not a clean story. A witness who had seen every room, heard every conversation, and spent 6 years inside the most sensitive parts of Bumpy's operation was not a variable that could simply be neutralized with a favor and a warning. The people above Caruso still had leverage over Marcus's brother. The pipeline, even if currently suspended, could be reopened. The damage that had already been done, the moves that had been blunted. The timing that had been compromised, that damage was real, and it had cost Bumpy ground he had not yet fully recovered. Bumpy sat alone in the laundromat after Marcus left. Nobody could say with certainty what decision was made in that room that night. The door was closed. The light was still flickering. And the only person who knows what Bumpy Johnson concluded in that hour of silence is the man himself. And he took most of it to the grave. What people understood, in the way Harlem always understood things without needing them spelled out, was that some betrayals carry a price that gets paid in full, and some get paid in installments. And the difference depends entirely on how useful the betrayer still is and for how much longer. Betrayal is never a mistake. It is always a choice. And every choice in that world had a number attached to it, whether or not the number was ever spoken aloud. The streets were wrong on Monday. Not dangerous. Wrong just off. Like a clock that's lost 30 seconds and hasn't been noticed yet. The usual rhythms of Harlem's working week were slightly out of phase. The delivery trucks came late. The corner conversations were shorter than normal. The men who stood outside certain buildings at certain hours were standing in slightly different places, or not standing there at all. Anyone who knew how to read a neighborhood would have understood immediately. Something had been reorganized overnight. Bumpy had spent Sunday building the architecture of what came next. He had identified 9 collection points, the specific corners, doorways, and back rooms where Brooklyn's crew received their weekly payments from Harlem's businesses. 9 points, spread across 12 blocks, operating on a schedule that had become routine enough that the collectors arrived within the same 15-minute window every week. Regular as a delivery service, confident as men who had never been seriously challenged. That confidence was about to become a liability. He didn't send soldiers. He didn't send men with weapons or threats or anything that could be identified as a counter-operation. He sent people who lived on those blocks, men and women who had been there for decades, who knew every doorway and alley and sightline, who owed Bumpy favors or money or simply understood that what was happening to their neighborhood required them to do something. The instruction was the same for all of them: make the collection impossible without confrontation. A woman named Gloria, who ran a hair salon on 129th Street, arranged to have her lease signing a loud, lengthy affair involving a notary, her sister, her sister's husband, and approximately 6 neighbors as witnesses take place in the exact doorway where Brooklyn's collector made his Monday pickup. At the exact time the pickup was scheduled, the collector arrived, found the doorway physically impassable with people, and waited, and waited, and after 40 minutes of waiting, left with nothing. 3 blocks over, a water pipe in the building where another collection happened to occur developed a sudden and dramatic leak that required the immediate attention of every person in the building, including the shop owner who would have otherwise been handing over an envelope. At a third location, 2 men got into an argument in the middle of the sidewalk, a loud, extended, entirely theatrical dispute about a parking spot that brought 3 squad cars to the block within 20 minutes. Brooklyn's collector, standing 40 feet away with cash in his pocket that he had no business having, walked away before the police finished taking statements. By 4 o'clock Monday afternoon, 5 of the 9 collection points had produced nothing. By 6 o'clock, the number was 7. The two that succeeded did so because Bumpy had chosen to let them succeed specific locations where he needed Brooklyn to believe the operation was still running normally, feeding the illusion that whatever was disrupting their collection routes was random and uncoordinated rather than precisely engineered. Caruso received the Monday report that evening. The version of events that reached him described mechanical failures and bad timing and an unusual amount of police activity. It did not describe anything that looked like a deliberate campaign, because nothing Bumpy had done that day looked like a deliberate campaign. It looked like a bad Monday. Caruso did not believe in bad Mondays. Not this consistently. Not across this many locations. Not at this level of inconvenience. He responded the way Bumpy had predicted he would by escalating. On Tuesday morning, Brooklyn sent reinforcements. Not intermediaries or collectors, but a harder group of men, 7 of them, with instructions to accompany the collection teams and ensure that whatever had happened Monday did not happen again. They were visible, physically imposing, and clearly intended to serve as a demonstration of what happened when someone interfered with Brooklyn's business. The neighborhood noticed them immediately. What Brooklyn hadn't accounted for was that visibility in Harlem worked differently than it did in their own territory. In Brooklyn, visible force communicated strength. In Harlem, in 1948, visible force by outsiders communicated something else entirely. It communicated that the outsiders were afraid, that their operation was fragile enough to require protection, that the ground they were standing on was not as solid as they had believed. The shopkeepers saw it. The people on the corners saw it. Harlem read the reinforcements not as a threat but as a tell. And on Tuesday afternoon, when Brooklyn's reinforced collection teams made their rounds, they found something they hadn't encountered the week before: silence. Not the silence of compliance, but the silence of closed doors. Shops that had been paying for 2 weeks were suddenly closed for inventory, or family emergencies, or reasons that didn't need to be stated because the door being locked said everything necessary. Only 4 collections succeeded on Tuesday. 2 of those were the locations Bumpy had deliberately left open. The real number was 2. Caruso escalated again on Wednesday. One of the shop owners who had refused to open his door received a visit that evening that broke 2 of his windows and left a message written on his wall in language that required no translation. It was the kind of move that had worked in other neighborhoods, in other contexts, against people who had no structure behind them. In Harlem, it had the opposite effect. By Thursday morning, the story of what had been written on that wall had traveled to every block in the neighborhood. Not through newspapers, not through official channels, through the invisible, instantaneous network of people who share a community and understand that what happens to one person's wall can happen to any wall. The money flow had been running at full capacity 2 weeks earlier. By Thursday of that week, it was at roughly 30%, and falling. Brooklyn was spending more on additional men, on transportation, on the friction of an operation that was fighting resistance at every point and receiving less. The arithmetic of it was unsustainable. Power without money is just noise. Brooklyn had been making noise for 2 weeks, but Harlem had stopped paying for it. And in that world, when the money stops, everything else stops eventually too, whether the people losing it are willing to admit it or not. Some of the specific figures from that week were never verified. The amounts, the exact number of collections that failed, the precise cost to Brooklyn's operation. Those details exist in memories and in conversations that were never recorded, passed down through people who were there and are no longer here to be questioned. What is not in dispute is the direction of it. The money was bleeding out, and Brooklyn, for the first time since crossing into Harlem, was beginning to understand that the man they had dismissed as a local problem managing a shrinking operation had, somehow, without a single public confrontation, turned their entire revenue stream into a wound that would not stop draining. Wednesday night came in cold and dry. No rain, just hard March darkness, sharp air. Empty sidewalks, the distant sound of traffic from avenues too far away to matter. Harlem's streets had a quality that night that the people who lived there recognized without being able to name. Everything was present. Nothing was happening. The silence had teeth. Both sides were waiting. Brooklyn's remaining crew had pulled back to 3 consolidated positions after the collection failures. They were still in Harlem, still visible, still technically operational, but the confidence that had carried them through the first week had been replaced by something harder and less comfortable. They were waiting for Bumpy to make a move they could respond to. Something clear, something physical. Bumpy gave them nothing, because giving them nothing was the move. He had spent Tuesday evening with a man named Raymond, 53 years old, lived on the same Harlem block for 31 years, spent his days moving between barbershops, church steps, and street corners where information pooled like rainwater. He knew everyone. More importantly, everyone talked around him without thinking, because Raymond had spent decades perfecting the appearance of a man who simply absorbed the world without acting on it. He was the most effective instrument Bumpy Johnson had ever used. Almost no one knew it. Bumpy gave Raymond 2 hours and 1 instruction. Not lies. Never lies, just true things, arranged in the right sequence, delivered to the right ears in the right order. The story was simple arithmetic. Brooklyn had been in Harlem 2 weeks. They had beaten old men, broken windows, frightened children, and despite all of it, their collections had dropped every single week. The numbers didn't lie. By noon Wednesday, every barbershop, church basement, and corner gathering between 110th and 145th Street had done the math. Brooklyn was failing in Harlem. The effect was immediate. The deference Brooklyn's physical presence had enforced the lowered eyes, the quick movements, the careful distance began dissolving, not dramatically, in small increments that added up to something fundamental. Old men returned to their stoops. Shop owners kept their doors open past 6. Kids reappeared on the sidewalks. Brooklyn's men noticed how they were being looked at. They had arrived as a force feared, given space, acknowledged. Now the neighborhood was watching them with something worse than hostility. Assessment. Harlem was doing the math out loud. Caruso made the decision Bumpy had been engineering him toward. Thursday morning. 2 of Brooklyn's men walked into Arthur Gaines's hardware store on 132nd Street, pulled the owner from behind his counter in front of 4 customers, and threw him against the wall hard enough to knock 3 shelves of merchandise to the floor. They delivered their message loudly enough for everyone to hear, then walked out. Those 4 customers were on the street within minutes. By Thursday afternoon, Raymond didn't need to say a single word. The story traveled on its own, but it traveled differently now, not as a tale of Brooklyn's failure, as a tale of Brooklyn's desperation. Men who are winning don't throw hardware store owners against walls in front of witnesses. Men who are winning collect quietly and go home. Harlem understood the difference immediately. By Thursday evening, 2 of Caruso's mid-level men had quietly stopped showing up. They had families. They had read the situation with the clarity of people whose survival depends on reading situations correctly. And what they read was that they were on the losing side of something that hadn't finished losing yet. Rumors move faster than facts in any neighborhood, but that week in Harlem, the rumor and the fact had become the same thing, and both pointed in the same direction. Bumpy spent Thursday evening at home. He ate dinner. He read. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. He had done nothing visible for 48 hours. No confrontation. No threat. No move that Brooklyn could identify or respond to directly. He had simply allowed Raymond's arithmetic to circulate. allowed Caruso's frustration to build to the point of a public mistake, and allowed Harlem itself to render its verdict on the people trying to own it. The old-timers in Harlem used to say that the men who last longest in this business aren't the loudest or the strongest. They're the ones who know exactly when to go completely still. Caruso had one move left. Everyone on both sides understood it. The question was whether he was smart enough not to take it. He wasn't. The light above Caruso's table had been flickering for an hour. He sat in the back room of a restaurant on the edge of Harlem that Brooklyn had been using as a command point, staring at papers that told a story he couldn't change. Week 1, solid collections. Week 2, reduced but defensible. Week 3, less than 20% of projection. The men above Caruso had called twice in 4 days. The second call had not been a check-in. It had been a deadline. 48 hours to demonstrate the Harlem operation was viable. The consequences of failure had been made clear without elaboration. Caruso decided to go directly at Bumpy Johnson. It was the logic of a man with no good options, force a direct confrontation that would either resolve the problem or escalate it beyond the point of retreat, compelling the people above him to commit fully rather than pull back. It made sense only if you had completely misunderstood your opponent. Bumpy had known this moment was coming since Tuesday. The entire previous week, the collection disruptions, the reputation campaign. Caruso's mounting frustration had been constructed with this endpoint in mind. A direct move required Caruso to expose his command structure in ways the indirect operations never had. He would concentrate his best people. He would have to communicate in ways that left traces. The man Caruso depended on was named Dominic. Not a boss, the person who translated decisions into street-level execution. He had run operations in 2 neighborhoods before Harlem. He managed the crews, maintained discipline, kept the entire operation coherent under pressure. Without Dominic, Caruso's remaining men were individually capable and collectively useless. Bumpy had identified Dominic in the first week and spent 3 weeks watching him, resisting every opportunity, waiting for the moment when removing him would do maximum damage rather than simply obvious damage. Friday morning was that moment. Dominic left his apartment at 7:45, the same time every morning for 3 weeks. He walked 2 blocks to a waiting car. The car was not from Brooklyn. The 2 men inside had been sitting since 6:30, drinking cold coffee, waiting with the patience of people who understood exactly why they were there. What happened took less than 4 minutes. No official record of that morning exists anywhere. What Harlem knew and what traveled through the neighborhood within hours was that Dominic did not arrive at his regular location, and that the people waiting for him waited a very long time before understanding he was not coming. By 10 o'clock, 3 of Brooklyn's crew leaders had received no communication and had no protocol for operating without it. By noon, 2 collection teams had simply returned to Brooklyn. By 2 o'clock, a 4th crew leader made the same calculation that whatever was happening in Harlem had crossed from a business problem into a personal survival problem, and the correct response was to remove yourself from the location of the danger. The operation dissolved team by team, block by block, across a single Friday afternoon. No explosion, no dramatic confrontation. Just the slow, inevitable settling of a structure whose load-bearing wall had been quietly removed. Caruso's last message to Brooklyn was carried back across the bridge by a young driver, too unimportant to be a priority for anyone. He delivered it in person, spoke for 40 minutes without interruption, and ended with Friday morning. One of the men listening asked, "How did Johnson know about Dominic?" The driver shook his head. "Nobody knows." That was accurate. No document captured the decision that ended Brooklyn's presence in Harlem. When the head is removed, the body doesn't need to be killed. It stops on its own, and Brooklyn learned that on a Friday afternoon in March 1948, 1 block at a time. The shops opened on Monday. Not all at once, but by 9 o'clock. Lights were on in windows that had been dark for 3 weeks. By noon, the sound of Harlem working had returned to the streets, almost the same as before. The almost mattered. Roosevelt Webb reopened his dry cleaning shop with 2 broken ribs still taped under his shirt. He moved slowly, accepted his first customers without speaking about what had happened, and kept his eyes on the door. Daniel Park's grocery opened an hour later. His 11-year-old son stayed home. Daniel understood the boy needed time, and that time was something they had again. Which was not nothing. Brooklyn was gone. Not regrouping, not 2 blocks over. Gone completely. Leaving behind only damage and the memory of fear, which takes longer to clear than broken windows. Bumpy Johnson made no announcement, no meeting, no statement. Nothing resembling a declaration of victory. He resumed his normal routines with the same unhurried steadiness he had maintained throughout Visible on his usual blocks, greeting the people he always greeted, eating where he always ate, as though nothing had happened that required acknowledgement. But within 10 days, a new architecture was in place, not identical to what existed before those arrangements had been disrupted too thoroughly to simply reinstall. New. Cleaner in some ways. More explicitly understood. The shopkeepers who had been caught between 2 forces now had a single, clear relationship with a single authority. The terms involved costs nobody called by their correct name, but the alternative had been demonstrated in concrete terms, and nobody needed the lesson repeated. The observers had been watching. There are always observers, men on the periphery of power who wait for a gap wide enough to step into. Several had watched the Brooklyn situation with patient attention, taking careful notes. They saw what Bumpy had done. They saw how he had done it. And they reached the same conclusion. Independently, the gap they had been watching for was not going to appear. One of them, a careful man from Upper Manhattan, reportedly told someone he trusted a few weeks later. I watched the whole thing. 3 weeks. I still don't understand half of what he did, and the half I don't understand is the half that won it. The full story of those 3 weeks was never told in any single place by any single person. The people who knew the most had the strongest reasons to stay quiet, and they did. These stories survive only because the people who lived them passed along just enough to keep the memory breathing, never enough to give away what actually mattered. Harlem moved forward. Signs came down from windows. Deliveries ran on time. Kids returned to the sidewalks. Old men resumed their positions on stoops they had occupied for decades, sitting in the afternoon sun with the quiet steadiness of people who have survived something and chosen not to make a production of it. The question nobody asked directly, but that sat in the back of every room where people understood what had happened, was whether what Bumpy had built was meaningfully different from what Brooklyn had tried to build. Whether protection, when practiced by someone from your own neighborhood with the right history and the right tone, was something other than what it appeared to be. There was no clean answer. There never is. Power doesn't disappear when you remove the people holding it. It waits for the next set of hands. What Bumpy Johnson had established was simply that his hands were steadier, smarter, and more deeply rooted in Harlem than anyone who had come before or would come after for a while. At least, the shops were open, the streets were breathing, and somewhere in the back of a room that no longer exists, the man who had engineered the entire thing was already thinking about what came next. Brooklyn left. Harlem breathed again. The shops reopened. The lights came back on. The old men returned to their stoops like nothing had happened because in Harlem, survival was never celebrated. It was simply continued. Bumpy Johnson walked the same streets he had always walked. No victory speech, no visible satisfaction. Just a man who had protected something he believed was worth protecting. using methods that history has never been comfortable enough to fully write down. But here's the question that has stayed with this story for 70 years. Was what Bumpy built after Brooklyn left truly different from what Brooklyn had tried to build? Or did Harlem simply trade one kind of fear for a more familiar one? There are no clean answers in stories like this, only the weight of what was chosen and what it cost, and who paid. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it waiting, the ones history only dared to tell, halfway. Subscribe, so you don't miss what comes next, and tell us if you had been a shopkeeper on those streets in 1948. Would you have trusted Bumpy Johnson, or would you have seen two different versions of the same danger?